Imagine this. You're past 60, living alone on an old family ranch, and each day feels a little harder than the last. The house is falling apart bit by bit, and the little money you have barely covers the basics. And then, one morning, just another ordinary day, you decide to give away everything you've built over a lifetime to a family you've never even met. Not for praise, not for attention, but because your own sense of honor leaves you no other choice. And the next morning, you see something you'd never expect, a line of black government SUVs rolling up your dirt road. Welcome to Heartland Stories. I'm Ethan Hale, and here I share true stories about honor, kindness, and quiet strength. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a man whose name you probably never heard. But it's men like him who remind us, honor isn't just a word. It's a choice, and sometimes, the hardest one you'll ever make. Ready to hear how one veteran saved a stranger's family, and in doing so, changed his own life forever? Then hit that like button, and let's get into it. Clyde Randall stood on his porch, leaning against a worn wooden post, staring out across the dry land as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the sky deep gold and crimson. He ran a cracked, calloused hand over his stubbled jaw and let out a long, tired breath. It had been months since the ranch had seen a drop of rain, and the earth under his boots was splitting open, baked hard by the sun, like it had given up on giving him anything more. Clyde was 67, though he looked older, like the years had taken more from him than they should have. Once, he had been a Marine. Strong, unbreakable, trained to keep going when everything inside you says stop. But now, the strength was fading, a little more with each sunrise, and keeping the ranch running felt like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. He'd been living alone for nearly 5 years. When Linda passed cancer, something inside Clyde had gone quiet. He'd sat by her bed every day, holding her hand, pretending he was still strong enough for both of them. But when she was gone, it felt like half the house had disappeared with her. Each room echoed differently now, empty in ways he couldn't fix. His son, Brian, had moved to another state long ago, working some big corporate job, calling less and less over the years. Their conversations, when they happened, were full of long silences and words that didn't quite reach across the miles. The gap between them grew wider every year, until it became a quiet, painful distance neither seemed willing to cross. Clyde never complained. He believed a real man handled his own problems, even when the weight got heavy enough to break your back. He patched up the old barn that the next good wind might knock down. He fixed the fences that kept sagging under the Texas sun. He climbed up onto the roof to slap another patch on the shingles every time the storms peeled one loose. He grew vegetables in a dry patch of dirt out back, kept a couple of cows even though they barely earned their keep anymore. His small veteran's pension just about covered the property taxes and the water bill, both of which kept climbing as the drought dragged on. On the days when his body refused to cooperate, Clyde just clenched his jaw and kept moving, because he didn't know how to live any other way. This was his land, his grandfather's, his father's, passed down to him along with a simple, heavy promise: keep it alive, no matter what. He felt like the last guard at a forgotten fortress, the only one left who still cared whether it stood or crumbled into dust. Every morning, he woke before the sun, brewed himself a pot of strong, bitter coffee in an old beat-up percolator, and sat down at the plain wooden table by the window. He would sip it slow, watching the world outside start to stir, feeling the burn of the coffee pulling him back to his feet for another day. That evening, watching the red sun sink behind the barren fields, Clyde found himself wondering how much longer he could keep living this way. But he shook the thought off. As long as his hands could grip a hammer, as long as his legs could carry him, as long as he could stand and face another morning, he had no choice but to keep going. Tomorrow would bring another hard day. More work. More worry. He let out a breath, long and low, and stepped back inside, never guessing how soon a small, unexpected moment would change everything he thought he knew about his life. The house sat still in the half-light. Only the faint glow from a street lamp outside bled through the thin curtains, casting a pale, steady sheen across the worn wooden floor. Clyde sat in the rocking chair by the cold fireplace, no wood, no fire, no real need anymore. In his hands, he held a battered photo frame, a little crooked, but still intact, like the memory it carried. The photo showed Linda, young, laughing, dressed in a simple white summer dress, a crown of wildflowers in her hair. She was holding Clyde's hand, tossing her head back in a way that caught the sun. It was taken the summer he came home from the Corps. They'd gone to the lake that weekend, full of dreams, full of light, when it still felt like the whole world lay ahead of them, waiting with open arms. Clyde traced a finger over the glass, as if he could still feel the warmth of her smile. 5 years gone, and yet this house still carried her breath, her laughter, like she might step into the next room at any moment. Sometimes he caught himself talking to her without realizing it, asking, wondering, just needing to hear her voice one more time. Those last days in the hospital stayed burned into his mind. The sharp scent of disinfectant. Nurses speaking soft words but avoiding his eyes. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, pretending he could somehow anchor her here with him. And then, when her voice was barely more than a whisper, Linda had looked at him with a clarity that cut through everything else. Clyde. Her voice cracked, but her eyes held steady. If you ever have the chance, do something good. Just because you can. Even if no one ever sees it. Even if no one ever says thank you. He hadn't answered. Just nodded and squeezed her hand tighter, as if that could hold her in place a little longer. Those words never left him. They etched themselves into him, not like an order, not like a burden, but as a truth he could no longer live without. Clyde carefully placed the photo back on the shelf and stood, his spine crackling in protest. He didn't pay it any mind. He walked over to the window and stared into the night. The Texas evening wrapped around the ranch like a worn blanket, heavy with quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, sharp and lonely, then all fell still again. He stood there a long time, and in that silence, he could almost hear her voice, not in words, but in the way the air trembled, in the way his own heart answered back. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was enough to remind him. Kindness isn't a transaction. It's a choice. Morning started like it always did. Clyde woke before dawn, pulled on a pair of old jeans and a thick flannel shirt, and padded barefoot across the creaking floor. He set the battered enamel coffee pot on the stove. The air outside had turned colder. Lately, nighttime temperatures kept dipping lower than he was used to. He tossed a few splinters into the stove and lit a match, but the fire was slow to catch. Sitting down at the kitchen table, he grabbed the morning paper, the Garrison County Tribune. The mailman still brought it by, the only man Clyde spoke to more than once a week. He flipped through the pages without much thought, the same old headlines: economy, drought, new water restrictions. Nothing new, nothing good. But then his eyes caught a short article, buried halfway down page 2. A small black and white photo, a woman standing with 2 kids in front of a rundown house. The caption read, "Veteran's widow facing eviction. Bank demands vacate order." He leaned in and read the piece carefully. Alicia Mason, widow of Sergeant Johnny Mason, had been served an eviction notice. After Johnny's funeral, he died of cancer. The family had drained their savings just to bury him. Now, with nothing left to cover the mortgage, they had 30 days to leave. A woman with 2 kids and no steady income. Clyde set his coffee cup down a little too hard, spilling some across the paper without even noticing. Johnny Mason. The name hit him like a gunshot. A young, reddish-haired kid with a fast walk and an open, honest face. They hadn't served in the same unit, but they'd crossed paths once in Fallujah. Johnny had been hauling wounded men under fire, moving faster and with more heart than any order could have demanded. It was a small moment, nothing that would ever make the news, but Clyde remembered it. He remembered Johnny, no more than 22, running back into the hail of gunfire for one more man, even when everyone else had already pulled out. He remembered him yelling for someone to hold on and dragging him clear, bloodied and gasping but alive. Johnny wasn't the kind of man who sought out medals. He just did what needed doing. Clyde had no idea what happened to him after the war. The world was wide, and people drifted apart. He didn't follow up on his old unit. Too many memories he didn't care to stir up. But now Johnny's name was ringing in his head like an old song you hadn't heard in years and couldn't shake loose once it started playing. He looked back down at the photo. The woman stood firm, tired but not broken. The kids pressed close to her, wary-eyed, not begging, not pleading, just standing in the doorway of a home someone was trying to take away. Clyde sat there for a long while, staring at the story. Finally, he set the paper down, got up, and poured himself another cup of coffee. His hands trembled a little more than usual. Outside, dawn was breaking. The wind caught the loose shutter on the old barn, making it creak against the frame. Everything around him stayed the same, but something inside him shifted, and there was no going back. Clyde fired up his old pickup. The engine coughed like it wanted to protest, but after a few stubborn grumbles, it caught. That truck had been ready for the graveyard a long time ago, but Clyde kept it running the way you do an old friend, changing the oil, tightening whatever started rattling, and saying a quiet thanks every time it still carried him where he needed to go. The road into town was dusty and rough, full of potholes nobody had bothered to fix for the better part of a decade. On one side stretched dry, cracked fields. On the other, blackened tree skeletons, burned by the sun and the endless drought. The only sound was the hum of the motor and the occasional thud when a tire hit a rut. Clyde drove in silence, gripping the wheel like more than just steering depended on it. There were only a handful of cars in the bank's parking lot. Inside, it was cool and still, the dry, conditioned air a sharp contrast to the hot, dusty world outside. Clyde walked up to the counter, took off his hat, and gave a small nod to the teller, a young woman with a strained smile. "Good morning, Mr. Randall," she said, recognizing him. "What can I help you with today?" Clyde pulled a folded-up notepad from his pocket, neat numbers written out in pen, along with his account slip. He paused for a second, rolling the paper between his fingers, before handing it across the counter. "I need to close my account," he said. "Cashier's check. Make it out to Alicia Mason." The teller frowned and checked the screen. That's the full amount," she said cautiously. $18,742.33. "Are you sure?" Clyde nodded. Calm as if he were asking for change. "I'm sure." From the back of the lobby, a low chuckle carried over. "Look at that," a voice said. Old Man Randall playing hero again. Clyde turned slightly. Standing by the door was Dan Harper, his neighbor, the same one who'd been pestering him for years to sell off his land. Harper stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile curling his lip. Next to him, another man shook his head. "A guy who can't even fix his own damn roof is handing out money to strangers," Harper said. "Probably thinks he'll get his name in the paper or something." Clyde didn't answer. He just turned his eyes back to the teller. "Please," he said simply. The young woman nodded and started typing. Clyde watched her hands, young, smooth, sure. He glanced down at his own, rough, scarred, calloused, and knew they'd never be like that again. When she handed him the cashier's check, he folded it carefully, slipped it into a plain envelope, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt. He picked up the receipt and headed for the door. "Hope it's worth it," Harper called after him. Clyde paused at the threshold but didn't turn around. "Sometimes, Dan," he said quietly, so only the ones who cared to listen would hear. "Doing the right thing is worth it all by itself." He stepped outside into the bright morning sun, heat already shimmering up off the asphalt. His pickup waited by the curb like an old dog, faithful and steady. Clyde climbed in, fired up the engine, and headed back down the dusty road, the same one, past the same empty fields. He drove in silence. But inside, there was a strange kind of peace. Not joy, not pride, just the quiet certainty that, this time, he had done what was right. That evening was especially warm. The sky above the ranch had faded into a soft lavender haze, and the whole world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for nightfall. Clyde sat at the table on the porch, sealing the envelope with the cashier's check inside. The paper crinkled softly under his fingers. Every move he made felt deliberate, heavy, like he wasn't just sealing away money, but a piece of himself. The low rumble of an engine broke the stillness, and soon an old SUV pulled up by the gate. Out stepped a stocky, gray-haired man with a slow, heavy walk. It was Frank Miller, Clyde's closest neighbor, a man he'd worked beside for decades when they were both younger, stronger. Frank made his way up the steps, moving like a man with something on his mind. "Heard about what you pulled today," Frank said without any small talk, leaning his elbows on the porch rail. "Word is you cleaned out your whole account. Gave it all to some woman you don't even know." Clyde said nothing. He wasn't about to start explaining himself. Frank waited a beat, then pressed on. "You remember when Linda got sick?" he said, voice low and tired. "Where were all these people then? Who helped you? Who brought you a check?" He wasn't angry, just weary, a man too familiar with disappointment. "No one came, Clyde," Frank said. You carried it all on your own. And now you're giving away your last dollar to some widow you never even met? What? Clyde looked at him, not with anger, but with the kind of calm you only find when you've already made peace with your choice. She's not just a widow, Clyde said quietly. She's Johnny Mason's wife. You probably don't remember him, but I do. He was just a kid, stubborn as hell, with eyes too big for his face. In Fallujah, he pulled 3 men out from under fire. Not for medals, not for glory, just because it was the right thing to do. Frank was silent. That was a long time ago, he muttered. That was war. And this is life, Clyde said, almost a whisper. Sometimes there's no real difference. I didn't leave my brothers behind back then. I'm not about to start now. Frank shook his head slowly. It won't change anything, he said. No one's going to notice. No one's going to remember. I'm not doing it for that, Clyde said, lifting his gaze to meet his friend's. I just don't want to leave this world and have it mean nothing. If one kid gets to sleep in his own bed tonight because somebody somewhere did the right thing, that'll be enough. Silence settled between them. The first crickets of the evening began their slow, scratchy song, filling the space where words had run out. You're a stubborn old man, Clyde, Frank said gruffly as he turned back toward his truck. Maybe so, Clyde replied, watching him go. But I'll die with that stubbornness. And I'll die easy. The next morning was cool and crisp, but Clyde wasn't met with silence or the breeze he was used to. Instead, there on the front door, right at eye level, was a piece of paper stapled neatly to the wood, bold black letters at the top. Notice of pending foreclosure. It took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. The paper swayed in the draft, and the words seemed to blur, as if a thick fog had settled between him and the page. He pulled it down, unfolded it, and read it slowly. The bank was informing him that, because of missed mortgage payments, foreclosure proceedings were starting immediately. He had 30 days to pay up or move out. This hit harder than he thought anything still could. The house his grandfather had built, the house his family had kept alive through wars, storms, and worse, now risked being taken by a bank. All because, years ago, when Linda got sick, he'd taken out a loan against it to pay her hospital bills. Clyde sat down on the porch steps, the paper still crumpled in his hand. He sat there a long time, staring at nothing. It all moved too fast. Normally, the bank would send warning letters first, maybe make a few calls. Now, straight to official notice. Someone had rushed this. Someone had seen the money move and made a decision. Later that day, closer to noon, he drove into town. He needed chicken feed and some dog food. The store was nearly empty. When he got to the counter, the young clerk, a kid Clyde had known since he was knee-high, wouldn't meet his eyes. Mr. Randall. The boy mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. I gotta say, store policy changed. It's cash only now. I'm real sorry. I'll settle up when the pension check comes in, Clyde said. Steady. Just like always. You know I don't run tabs. I know, sir, the boy said quickly. It's just boss's orders. New rules. I understand, Clyde said. He turned around and walked out without taking anything. Behind him, he heard a voice whisper something. Maybe Harper again. Maybe not. Didn't matter, the tone said enough. Outside, Clyde stopped at his truck and rested both hands on the hood. The metal was already warm from the sun. Same town, same people, but the way they looked at him, that was different now. Where there'd once been polite distance, there was something else now. Embarrassment. Avoidance. He climbed in, started the engine, and headed back down the road. Dry wind whistled through the open window. The road was empty, stretching out in front of him, just like he felt inside. Everything he had built, everything he had poured his hands and heart into, was now hanging by a thread. But even now, even with the system turning its back on him, he didn't regret it. There was pain, sure. There was fear, but not regret. Not an ounce. Clyde drove slowly down the town's main street, dusty, half abandoned, like the land itself was tired of waiting for folks to do better. The pickup groaned and muttered like an old man talking to himself. On the passenger seat sat a blank notepad, the same one he always used for shopping lists. Today, it stayed empty. No need for it. He rolled up to the turnoff that led to the ranch. But he didn't turn. He sat there for a second, gripping the wheel. Then he pushed the pedal and kept going straight. That's how he ended up at the County Veterans Services office. A small, worn-out building with a peeling sign and a faded flag drooping from a cracked pole. The parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, it smelled of stale air and old carpet. The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, the sound echoing off the tired walls. The waiting room was full, a row of veterans in scuffed jackets, some leaning on canes, others clutching folders in their laps. They sat in silence, staring at the floor, the weight of it all settling over the room like a heavy, invisible blanket. Clyde signed in at the kiosk and took a seat. Time crawled by, thick and slow. He thought back to the days when he could sit for hours without moving, waiting, watching, listening. Back then, patience was a weapon. Now, it just felt hollow. Like there was shame in even having to be here. Finally, his name was called. He stepped into a small office. Behind the desk sat a woman in a gray blazer, hair pulled tight, dark circles under her eyes. Clyde Randall, she said, checking the screen. Marine Corps. Confirmed. Minimal pension. Property ranch. Mortgage still active. Yeah, he answered shortly. She sighed, pushing her keyboard aside. Mr. Randall, I'm sorry. You don't qualify. The remaining value on your property's too high, even with the debt. I'm not asking for a house, Clyde said evenly. Just a little help. Enough to keep the livestock fed till the end of the month. I'll handle the rest. She looked at him, really looked this time, then leaned back in her chair. Let me be honest with you, she said quietly. Around here, help goes to the ones who get noticed. The ones with stories in the papers, on the internet. We've got funds, grants, but they move where the spotlight moves. Clyde didn't say a word. He just kept his eyes steady on her. You. She hesitated, dropping her gaze. You're just an old veteran with a mortgage. No cameras. No noise. So if no one's talking about me, Clyde said, voice low, then I don't matter. It's not right, she whispered. But it's how it works now. Clyde nodded once. Not an agreement, an understanding. A few minutes later, he was walking back across the hot, empty parking lot. Slow, steady, back straight. No arguing. No shouting. Just leaving. The sun beat down on the cracked asphalt. The road buzzed under the heat. Clyde climbed into the truck, rested his hands on the steering wheel, and stared out at the far-off horizon. And sitting there, in the heavy silence, he realized. Sometimes, the silence you live in can cost you everything. Twilight fell over the ranch fast. The silence came down like a dusty old blanket, slow, heavy, and sure. Clyde sat in the kitchen by the window. The old phone on the stand, its buttons worn smooth with age, still remembered the numbers his fingers knew by heart. He held the receiver for a long time without dialing. He didn't want to ask for anything. Not money, not help, not even advice. He just needed to hear his son's voice. Needed to know he was still out there, somewhere on the other end of the line, alive, whole, in that far-away, cold world of his, where the smell of manure didn't hang in the air and a call from your father felt more like an obligation than a blessing. Finally, he punched in the numbers. A few rings. Then a click. Hello. The voice was flat, tired, just a little surprised. The kind of voice that already expected a conversation that wouldn't go anywhere. Hey, it's me, Clyde said, calm. Dad. Everything okay? Yeah, just wanted to talk. Sure. How's everything? Clyde let out a dry little chuckle under his breath. Strange question, really. What was there to say? Everything's fine. Ranch is still standing. So am I. Silence hung between them. Clyde could hear clicking, maybe a keyboard, maybe a mouse. Heard it's been pretty hot out there, Brian said. Hot as hell. But the livestock's alive. I'm hanging in. Another pause. Anyway, just thought it's been a while since I heard your voice, Clyde added. Yeah. Sorry, Dad. Work's been nuts. You know how it is. I know. Don't worry about it. Wasn't calling for that. He paused, gripping the phone tighter for a second before speaking again, slower this time. Listen, if I was too hard on you when you were growing up, I'm sorry. I thought I was teaching you to stand on your own. Maybe I went too far. I don't know. Dad. Let me finish, Clyde said quietly. It matters to me. He took a breath. I didn't always know how to be a good father, but I hope to God you turned out better than I ever was. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Brian spoke, softer. "Thanks, Dad. That, that means a lot." Clyde nodded, even though his son couldn't see it. "Take care of yourself. And don't forget to eat right." "I will. You too, okay?" The line went dead. Clyde hung up the receiver. Outside, night had settled in fully. Somewhere off by the road, a coyote barked once and then went quiet. He poured himself a glass of water, sat back down. The words his son had said still lingered, soft but clear. And for now, that was enough. The night on the ranch was quieter than usual. Even the wind seemed to think better of disturbing the land. Only the old boards creaked underfoot, and the wall clock ticked off the seconds, each one dragging slower than the last. Clyde sat at the kitchen table. In front of him, a single sheet of paper, filled with neat, slightly shaky handwriting. It was a letter to his son. He wasn't asking for help. He just wrote what he hadn't been able to say over the phone. "I always wanted you to be free, to live your life the way you saw fit, to build your own way. I'm proud of you, even if I never learned how to say it right. I made a choice. I don't know if it was the right one, but it's mine, and I'll stand by it. If you ever decide to come back, the house will be here. Still mine for now." He placed a period at the end, folded the page carefully, and tucked it into an envelope. The house was dark. He didn't bother turning on the light, not to save money. It just felt wrong to break the stillness of that night. Suddenly, a knock. Soft, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Clyde stiffened. Nobody came out here at this hour. He stood up, grabbed a flashlight off the wall, and moved to the door. He opened it cautiously. A woman stood there, maybe mid-30s, short-cropped hair, plain clothes. But it was clear from her bearing, her steady gaze, the way she moved, military. Not some desk jockey. Not a tourist. "Mr. Randall?" she asked calmly. Clyde nodded. He didn't know who she was, but he didn't feel fear. Just a strange tension, the kind that comes before a storm that might either break over you or pass you by. She held out an envelope. "We can't go public yet," she said. "Not yet. But you're not alone. You've been seen." He opened his mouth to ask something, but she was already stepping back into the darkness. "Wait." "Thank you," she said simply. And then she was gone. A few seconds later, he heard the soft ignition of an engine, no headlights, pulling away fast toward the highway. Clyde closed the door and walked back to the kitchen. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single note, typed on plain white paper. "Your actions have not gone unnoticed. Stay ready. We're close." No signature. No insignia. He set the note down beside the letter he'd written to his son. He sat there for a long time, staring at the two envelopes. He didn't know exactly what it all meant. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he'd done the right thing. Morning started like any other. The coffee pot sputtered and popped on the stove. The wooden floor creaked underfoot. The air outside still smelled faintly of rain that had fallen months ago, as if the earth refused to forget. Clyde poured himself a mug of strong black coffee and stepped out onto the porch. He loved these few minutes before the world fully woke up, when everything still moved slow and steady, before the day showed its teeth. He took a sip and looked down the road, and froze. In the distance, through rising clouds of dust, something strange appeared. Black shapes. 1, 2, 3. He started counting out loud. 5, 7, 9, 11. 11 black SUVs, identical down to the last detail, moving in a slow, deliberate line up the gravel road toward his house. No license plates. No sirens. No noise beyond the deep, steady rumble of engines marching together like a column of soldiers. Clyde set his coffee cup down on the railing. The leftover coffee sloshed over the rim. He didn't move. Didn't step back. He just stood there, watching as the vehicles pulled up and lined themselves neatly along his long driveway. When the engines cut off, an eerie stillness settled over everything. No birds. No wind. Nothing but the weight of what was about to happen. For a few long seconds, nothing moved. Then, as if on a silent command, the driver's doors opened all at once. Out of each SUV stepped a figure in uniform: Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy. Men and women. They formed up in a line across the yard, standing at attention, no words spoken, no gestures made. From the lead SUV, the last to exit was a tall man with silver hair, his posture sharp and sure. He wore full dress uniform, a general's stars gleaming on his shoulders. He walked slowly toward the porch, stopping at the foot of the steps. And there, crisp and formal, he saluted. "Mr. Clyde Randall," the man said in a firm, steady voice. "I'm General James Martin, United States Department of Defense, Special Internal Operations Division." Clyde straightened instinctively, ignoring the creak and pull in his shoulders, and returned the salute. "Not quite sure what's happening here, General," he said slowly. Martin gave a slight nod, standing tall. "You made a decision you thought was a simple act of kindness," the general said. "But it turned out to be a critical piece of a national security operation." Clyde frowned, the words not fitting together in his mind. "It concerns the family of Sergeant Johnny Mason," Martin continued. "Your donation prevented them from having to seek public aid, which would have exposed them inside the system." He paused, letting that sink in. Sergeant Mason wasn't just a Marine. He was part of Operation Baltic Shield, a classified initiative to uncover international extremist financial networks. Before he died, he provided key intelligence. His family has been under deep cover ever since, protected as critical witnesses. Clyde stood still as stone, breathing shallow, steady. "Your act of kindness," the general said, voice low and sure, "protected their cover. You preserved the integrity of operations that will never make the news. You didn't do it on orders. You did it because it was right. And because of that, you saved more lives than you'll ever know." The general took a step closer. "I'm here to extend formal thanks from the Department of Defense. And to tell you, you're not alone, Mr. Randall. You've been seen. We're here today because you did something most wouldn't." Clyde nodded slowly, saying nothing. His eyes held a trace of confusion, but deeper behind it, there was something else, a quiet acceptance. He didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, he knew what he had done mattered. Clyde stood on the porch, still trying to make sense of what he was seeing. In front of him, soldiers from every branch of the military. Behind them, a line of black SUVs. And standing face to face with him, a general telling him that he, a simple old man with cracked hands and worn boots, had somehow played a part in a national security operation. From one of the vehicles, a woman stepped out. She wore plain clothes, but there was no mistaking her. The way she carried herself, the way she scanned the world, military through and through. Confident, trained, a soldier at heart. She held a leather folder stamped with a gold crest. "Mr. Randall," she began evenly. "My name is Agent Keller. I work in the Department of Defense Intelligence Analysis Division. I've been asked to explain to you exactly what you did." She opened the folder. On the first page, a photograph. Johnny Mason. That same smile Clyde remembered from Fallujah. The red-headed kid with the straight-backed stance and the unforgettable eyes. Sergeant Mason was recruited into Operation Baltic Shield, Keller said. It was a multi-year initiative focused on uncovering international funding streams tied to extremist cells. She paused just long enough for Clyde to catch up. After he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, he volunteered to pass along critical intelligence, information that helped dismantle 3 major networks. He knew he didn't have much time left, and he chose to go out doing the most he could. Clyde listened, barely blinking. It felt like she was talking about someone else's life. After his death, his family was placed under full protective cover. New IDs, new lives, tight protocols. But things started to unravel, she said. The funeral drained everything they had, and Mrs. Mason, Alicia, was left with no real options. Either lose their home, or go to the authorities for help. She locked eyes with Clyde. One trip to a food bank, one meeting with a social worker, one paper trail, and their cover would have been blown. They were on the edge. And then, your check arrived. Clyde straightened where he stood, narrowing his eyes. "But all I did was send a check," he said, confused. "How could that change anything?" Agent Keller leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping, more personal now. "Mr. Randall, after her husband died, Alicia Mason had no money, no family, no way to safely ask for help. Their benefits came under assumed names. She couldn't even request food assistance without leaving a digital footprint. Her kids were under protection too. Every step was a risk." She paused, letting the words settle. They were a day away, one day, from going to county services, filing for aid. And that would have unraveled everything. Clyde stared at her, breathing slow, steady. And then, your check came. She didn't even cash it. She didn't have to. The simple fact that help showed up, quietly, privately, from another human being, gave her the strength to stop. To wait. To stay hidden. You didn't just give them money, Mr. Randall. You gave them something the system couldn't. The chance to keep their story and their safety intact. You gave them hope. Clyde gave a small nod. There was a lump in his throat, but he didn't let it show. He just exhaled, long and slow. I just didn't want them to feel alone, he said quietly. Agent Keller's face softened, just a little. No longer the government analyst, just a person. And that's exactly why what you did mattered, she said. You didn't know the full picture, but you did the thing someone had to do. Sometimes, that's all it takes to keep something far bigger from falling apart. Her words hung in the morning air. The officers behind her still stood in perfect formation. But there was no ceremony in it now. Only truth. General Martin stepped forward again, this time without a speech, without a report. In his hands was a small wooden case, polished to a soft matte finish, the Department of Defense crest carved into the lid. He climbed the steps and stopped right in front of Clyde. Mr. Randall, he said, his voice steady and deep. By order of the Secretary of Defense, and with the full endorsement of the Civilian Service Council, I am authorized to present you with the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, the highest award given to a civilian for actions that benefit national security. He opened the case. Inside was the medal, simple, unflashy, a blue ribbon holding a clean, unornamented medallion. Not built for parades. Built for people who had done real things, the quiet kind that mattered. Clyde didn't move, didn't speak. He just nodded once and straightened up by instinct, the way he would have years ago. An officer stepped up beside him and carefully pinned the medal to Clyde's shirt, right over the old chest pocket where, not so long ago, he had tucked away the last of his savings. And in addition, the general said, handing over a folder sealed with the department's insignia, you no longer owe the bank a single cent. Clyde blinked. How's that possible? He asked quietly. The Veterans Heritage Foundation has designated your property a protected historical site, the general explained. Part of the National Valor Preservation Program, which means your mortgage is canceled. Your home stays yours. Forever. Clyde took the documents with slow, deliberate hands. The paper was still warm from the general's touch. Everything about it was official. Signatures. Seals. Orders. He glanced down at the metal pinned to his faded shirt. It caught the morning light just slightly, not enough to shine, just enough to be real. I didn't do anything special, he said, almost in a whisper. The general looked him straight in the eye. And that, he said, is exactly what makes it special. There was no flattery in his voice. Only respect. The kind that had been earned the hard way. The next morning, the ranch sounded different. Right after sunrise, trucks rolled up, engineers, techs, builders, some in uniform, some in jeans and work boots, carrying toolboxes, measuring tapes, welding torches. No news cameras. No speeches. No banners. They just showed up and started working. The old barn roof, which had been sagging for years, was torn down before noon. Clyde had spent plenty of nights listening to the wind and wondering if he'd find it on the ground come morning. Now a new roof was going up, strong, clean, built the way things used to be built, to last. No plastic. No shortcuts. Just solid lumber, right angles, and 4 hands working in quiet rhythm. They dug out the old well too, the one that sputtered on dry mornings. Army Corps engineers pulled the pump, replaced the fittings, and even rebuilt the little fence around it, just the way Clyde's father had made it. One of the young Marines, a kid with a southern drawl, came up to Clyde and asked, "Sir, do you want us to replace that old flagpole? We can put in a new steel one if you'd like." Clyde glanced over at the crooked wooden pole, its paint peeling and worn by time. He shook his head and said quietly, "Leave it. Just tighten up the base. It's been here longer than I have. It'll stand a while yet." "Yes, sir," the young Marine said, no sarcasm, no grin, and went to work. Nobody rushed, but nobody wasted time either. Everything they did carefully, like they were restoring something sacred. And maybe, in a way, they were. Clyde sat on the porch and watched it all unfold. Coffee in one hand, old cap in the other. He didn't interfere. He didn't supervise. He just bore witness. People started to slow down as they passed the main road, some pausing, some nodding quietly before driving on. Among them was Dan Harper. He stood leaning against his truck for a while, watching as the Army engineers set the new fence post straight. He didn't say anything, didn't wave. He just took off his hat, held it for a few seconds, and drove away. Toward evening, a black sedan pulled up. Out stepped the local bank manager, the same man whose name had been signed at the bottom of Clyde's foreclosure notice. He looked uncomfortable, like he was standing in wet shoes. "Mr. Randall." He started awkwardly, but before he could say more, an officer from the Department of Defense's legal team walked over and quietly pulled him aside. Their conversation was low, but it didn't take much to read the banker's face shifting from stiff pride to quick, eager nods. At one point, he even exhaled sharply, like a man relieved to have escaped something worse. He left fast. Nobody asked Clyde for an interview. Nobody launched a drone for a fancy overhead shot. They just worked. With care. With respect. Because they understood. This wasn't about a veteran. This wasn't about a symbol. It was about a man who once chose to do the right thing and changed everything. By midday, as the heat started crawling into the walls of the house, one of the Marines handed Clyde a sealed envelope. Thick paper. Postmarked from the next county over. No return address. Just his name, Clyde Randall, written in neat, careful handwriting. A woman's hand. He sat down on the porch, where the smell of freshly cut lumber still lingered on the rails, and opened it slowly. Inside was his own check, the one he'd given at the bank 2 weeks earlier. Straightened. Uncreased. Untouched, and folded with it, a single handwritten letter. The ink was black, the line steady. "Mr. Randall, you don't know us. We don't know you. But the day your gift arrived, we knew one thing. The world hadn't forgotten my husband. You saved us, not just from debt or fear. You reminded us that someone was still out there quietly, with no expectations, just there. But we can't let you lose your home just to save ours. We didn't cash the check. We're sending it back, because a true hero shouldn't have to pay that price for being kind. With deepest gratitude. Abigail, Emma, and Michael Mason." Clyde read it twice, then rested it on his knees and stared out at the open field, stretching off toward the horizon. He didn't know how to respond. Maybe he didn't need to. Sometimes, a letter is all that needs to be said. He folded the note gently, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the drawer in his bedroom. The one where he kept old photographs, his service tag, Linda's wedding band, and a few sun-faded postcards from his son. And then, from somewhere deep inside memory, came her voice. Soft, raspy from those final days, but still so clear. "Clyde, if one day you get the chance to do something good, do it. Even if no one sees. Even if no one says thank you." He hadn't known what to say back then. He just held her hand a little tighter. But now he knew. He had done it, not for recognition, but because once he made a promise. And he kept it. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he could almost hear her breathing beside him. And for the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel lonely. A month passed. The ranch had started breathing again. Not loud, just steady, like a man who'd been sick for a long time and finally got up to go back to work. The roof didn't leak anymore. The fence didn't creak in the wind. The old flagpole, the one with flaking paint and time-worn scars, still stood. The soldiers had straightened it, reinforced the concrete base, replaced the hardware, and ran a new rope. Every morning, Clyde raised the flag again, the same one that had flown there for decades. Slow. Steady. No anthem. Just the creak of wood and the whisper of cloth. Beneath the pole was a small metal plaque. No shine. No gloss. It read, "For those who do good, even when no one is watching." The livestock were healthy. The barn was solid. None of it felt remarkable. It just felt right. The way things were supposed to be. Clyde still rose before the sun. Still brewed coffee in that same old pot, keeping a careful eye to make sure it didn't boil over. Still stepped out onto the porch, leaning on the rail, listening to the silence. But it didn't press down on him anymore. It was full now. Alive. The kind of peace that only comes when you know you did what you were supposed to do. Sometimes, cars would pass down the gravel road. Unfamiliar. Black. No plates. They never stopped. but they always slowed down. Sometimes the driver would nod, just a little. Once, a passenger had even lifted a hand, a small, sharp military salute. Clyde never waved back, not out of coldness, because he knew everything that needed saying had already been said. He drank his coffee down to the last drop, the way he had for years, and then got to work. Work never ended, and that was good, because life goes on that way. Not with parades or loud speeches, but with mornings, the smell of earth, and the clanging of a bucket in your hand. It was an ordinary day, warm, quiet, a soft breeze lazily stirring the grass by the roadside. Clyde was fixing the fence line out by the far pasture, not urgent work, but work that needed doing. He was about to pack up when he noticed a figure walking toward him. It was a boy, 8, maybe 9 years old, dark hair under a crooked ball cap, a rolled-up piece of paper clutched in his hand. He moved steady but cautious, like he wasn't sure if he belonged. Clyde straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited. The boy came up close, lifted his chin, and held out the paper. "This is for you," he said, voice low. Clyde unfolded it carefully. A simple drawing, done in pencil and crayon. A house, a flag, a man standing on a porch, a boy standing next to him, holding his hand. At the bottom, in neat, careful letters, "Thank you. You're the first person who gave my dad peace." Clyde stared at the drawing for a long moment, not sure what to say. Something tightened deep in his chest, not pain. Something deeper. The kind of gratitude words just can't touch. He looked down at the boy again. The kid stood his ground, meeting Clyde's gaze without flinching. "Your dad?" "He was a good man," Clyde said softly. The boy nodded. "He said real kindness is quiet," he said. "You proved it." Clyde followed the boy's gaze and saw her then, standing by a parked car a ways off. Abigail. She didn't come closer. She didn't call out. She just nodded, once, short and full of meaning. It was all there. Recognition, gratitude, understanding. Clyde nodded back. The boy turned and headed back toward the car. Clyde stood there a long time, holding the drawing, watching him go. The breeze tugged gently at the paper in his hand. If you've ever helped someone, not for recognition, not for thanks, but simply because you couldn't walk past, know this. That matters. That is heroism too. If you believe real goodness doesn't need to shout to be real, leave a like and subscribe, so stories of quiet strength and everyday honor don't get lost in the noise. I'll see you in the next story.